I never thought a simple evening at my own home would turn into a standoff, worthy of a viral news clip, but that's exactly what happened. The sun had just begun to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across my driveway, when I heard a loud knock at the front door. It wasn't the familiar sound of a neighbor dropping by. It was sharp, demanding, and aggressive. When I opened the door, there she was, Karen, the notorious HOA enforcer I'd only heard about in hushed conversations. Her posture screamed authority, and her eyes, narrowed into thin slits, scanned my property as if it belonged to her. "You're trespassing!" she barked before I could even greet her. Her voice carried an audacious certainty, the kind that makes you question whether you're actually the intruder in your own life. Karen wasn't just any HOA member. She was infamous for escalating the smallest disagreements into full-blown neighborhood crises. But I had never expected her to storm my property, and certainly not with the level of confidence she carried that day. Clutching a binder labeled Community Rules, she waved it in the air, citing violations I didn't even know existed. "This is private property," I said, trying to maintain calm, but she didn't even pause. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I'm the owner's wife, and I won't tolerate this." For a moment I froze. The audacity of her claim made my heart skip. I tried to reason, explaining that I was, in fact, the homeowner. My words seemed to bounce off her like walls. Karen ignored my clarification and continued, listing supposed infractions, trash, cans too close to the curb, minor landscaping details, and even the placement of my welcome mat. Each accusation felt increasingly absurd. The neighbors watching from across the street began murmuring, unsure whether to intervene or stay out of it. Meanwhile, Karen's confidence only grew, as if the more ridiculous her claims became, the more legitimate they felt to her. By the time I realized the situation was escalating out of control, Karen had already dialed 911, reporting me as an intruder. The police arrived within minutes, their lights cutting through the soft evening haze. Karen, still standing in my driveway, attempted to explain her side, insisting that she had authority because of her supposed marital status. The officers listened carefully, taking in the bizarre scenario. Her eyes wide with indignation, locked on mine, clearly expecting me to shrink or comply. Instead, I calmly handed them the deed to the house, the official proof she couldn't refute. Her reaction was instantaneous. Shock, disbelief, and finally panic crossed her face, all in the span of a heartbeat. She hadn't accounted for facts, only assumptions, and those assumptions were about to cost her dearly. What followed next was a whirlwind of confusion, neighborly whispers, and a lesson in authority gone astray. By the end of the evening, Karen was not only humiliated, but arrested. Twice, in fact. But the full story, the chaos that led to that moment, had only just begun. The moment Karen realized the deed contradicted her claim, most people would have stepped back, accepted the mistake, and quietly retreated. Not Karen. Her expression shifted from shock to fury, a combustible mix of embarrassment and determination. She straightened her shoulders, adjusted her binder, and glared at me as if I had personally betrayed her. "This doesn't change anything," she snapped, her voice rising. "You think you can just ignore the rules? I'm taking action." That was when I understood. This wasn't about the house, or even the HOA. This was about control, and Karen would stop at nothing to assert it. Within minutes, she began pacing the driveway, phone pressed to her ear, narrating the situation to anyone who would listen. She called neighbors, local authorities, and even friends in nearby communities, insisting that I was trespassing and that she had evidence to prove it. She described the house, the yard, and my movements as though she were delivering a live report, each word dripping with self-righteous authority. Meanwhile, the real neighbors peered cautiously from windows and fences, unsure whether to intervene or record the unfolding drama. Cameras on phones began capturing her every gesture, her exaggerated expressions, and her frantic insistence on a reality that didn't exist. Karen's behavior escalated when she tried to physically enter the property. She tugged at the front gate, claiming she had permission, as the owner's wife, and that I was obstructing her rights. I blocked the entrance, keeping a calm but firm tone, repeating that I was the homeowner. Her voice became louder, more insistent, drawing the attention of more neighbors and pedestrians passing by. She didn't seem to hear the reasoning. To Karen, authority wasn't based on truth. It was claimed through confidence, volume, and persistence. By the time the police arrived for the second time, Karen had already made herself a spectacle. She argued loudly, pointing fingers, gesturing wildly, and reciting snippets of HOA rules she clearly didn't understand. The officers had been briefed about her earlier call, and they approached cautiously. Karen, however, seemed impervious to warnings or explanations. Every attempt to de-escalate only fueled her intensity. her insistence that she was right reaching a fever pitch. The crowd of neighbors watching quietly grew, some shaking their heads, others filming for posterity. Finally, the officers had no choice. Karen's refusal to step back or acknowledge reality led to her arrest. She resisted in her mind, not physically, but the outcome was inevitable. Handcuffs were applied, and she was guided to the patrol car while maintaining the same indignated posture she had carried throughout the confrontation. Neighbors whispered in disbelief, some laughing quietly, some shaking their heads. In that moment, it became clear. Karen's obsession with control had blinded her entirely. But that night was only the beginning. Her arrest didn't make her stop. If anything, it ignited her determination further, setting the stage for even more chaos in the days to come. What she didn't realize was that this house and I were not going to bend to her imagined authority, and her next moves would push the line even further. After her first arrest, most people would have taken a step back, maybe reconsidered their choices, but not Karen. By the next morning, she was back online, posting to neighborhood forums and social media groups, insisting she had been wronged, that the HOA had betrayed her, and that I was the real threat. Every sentence was dramatic, every claim exaggerated, and every punctuation mark felt like a declaration of war. Neighbors who read her posts were unsure whether to laugh or panic, while some forwarded screenshots to the police and HOA, bored as proof that the situation wasn't over. Karen's obsession had shifted from the property itself to the narrative surrounding it. She now saw herself as the victim and the hero simultaneously. Her words were carefully chosen to maximize outrage. She called the house a dangerous, trespassing site and described me as an unauthorized occupant. She shared her own recordings from the driveway the previous evening, cutting and splicing footage to make herself appear calm and authoritative while portraying me as aggressive, a total distortion of reality. By midday, she'd appeared at the property again, walking along the sidewalk outside the fence, phone in hand, narrating every movement in real time. She claimed she was conducting a community oversight inspection, a phrase she had clearly rehearsed. Her gestures were emphatic, her tone forceful, and she occasionally shouted toward the windows, daring me to come outside and confront her. The neighbors, now used to the spectacle, kept their distance, recording discreetly from behind hedges or from upper-floor windows. The police were called multiple times that day, but each visit ended similarly. Karen was technically on public property, and she hadn't committed a crime, yet. Her confidence only grew, and her boldness escalated the situation. She began following the mail carrier and delivery drivers, live-streaming each interaction, claiming they were participating in her so-called investigation. Even the HOA board members, who were initially hesitant, began documenting everything, recognizing that her behavior was now a serious liability for the community. By evening, Karen had drawn a small crowd. Curious neighbors gathered near the sidewalk, cameras in hand, capturing her every movement. Her energy was electric, chaotic, and impossible to ignore. But it was also dangerous, because the longer she stayed, the more likely someone, police or private, citizen would step in to enforce boundaries. Finally, after hours of public spectacle, an officer arrived and politely instructed her to leave the property. She argued for nearly 15 minutes, citing imaginary rights and fabricated rules, before realizing that her theatrics had limits. As she left the scene that night, murmurs circulated. Karen was unshakable. She didn't see arrests, warnings, or public humiliation as setbacks. They were evidence that she was right and others were wrong. The community understood that this wasn't over. Karen had transformed a single confrontation into a full-blown saga, and the next chapter would test patience, authority, and neighborhood order like never before. Karen's antics eventually caught up with her, and before long, the situation transitioned from chaotic neighborhood drama to official legal proceedings. The first court date was scheduled, and she arrived punctually, as if this were a stage rather than a courtroom. Her posture was rigid, her binder neatly in hand, and her gaze sweeping across the room with that familiar intensity. She seemed to carry the belief that merely showing up with confidence could rewrite reality. As she sat at the defendant's table, her hands clasped tightly, the officer who had arrested her the first evening approached to explain the charges and proceedings. Karen listened, but not really. Every word was filtered through the lens of authority she imagined she held. The courtroom itself was quiet and formal, a stark contrast to the chaos she had orchestrated in the neighborhood. Judges, clerks, and attorneys followed protocol with precision, but Karen's energy created a palpable tension. She leaned forward occasionally, whispering arguments to herself or gesturing subtly to her lawyer. Each movement communicated, defiance and an unshakable certainty that the system was wrong and that she was above it. Her lawyer, meanwhile, quietly reminded her to focus and comply, but Karen's attention was split between the legal proceedings and her own narrative of victimhood. The judge reviewed the initial charges calmly and methodically. Trespassing claims, obstruction of officers, and repeated harassment complaints. Karen naturally interrupted twice, correcting terminology and emphasizing technicalities, insisting that intent mattered more than law. The judge, with a firm tone, explained the difference between perception and legal reality. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Even seasoned court officers glanced at each other, silently acknowledging the persistence and audacity of this one individual. During testimony, neighbors who had witnessed her behavior were called to recount the events. Each statement reinforced what had already been captured on video. Karen had repeatedly asserted authority that did not exist, confronted multiple residents and officials, and refused to acknowledge boundaries. She attempted to counter with her own narrative, pointing to supposed HOA clauses and rights, but the documentation she presented was either irrelevant or misinterpreted. The stark contrast between perception and reality became clear, both to the courtroom and to Karen herself, though she refused to admit it. By the end of the session, the consequences were unavoidable. The judge handed down strict warnings, probation requirements, and clear orders preventing any future attempts to assert unauthorized authority. Karen left the courtroom visibly frustrated but unchanged in her belief that she had been wronged. Yet the community felt a sense of relief. Her behavior had been formally addressed, and legal boundaries were now firmly established. Still, her determination had not been extinguished. Karen saw the courtroom as just another stage on which she could perform, and the next confrontation was only a matter of time. Weeks passed after the courtroom session, and the neighborhood slowly began to breathe again. The fences, gates, and hedges were back in place. Children played in yards without glancing over their shoulders, and mail carriers moved through the streets without hesitation. On paper, Karen's authority had been neutralized. Probation, legal restrictions, and HOA oversight ensured she could no longer storm properties or confront residents at will. But even in her absence, the energy she had brought lingered like an invisible mark, a reminder of what unchecked obsession could do. Karen, for her part, did not disappear entirely. Social media feeds still carried updates from her accounts, posts edited to portray herself as the wronged party, comments dissecting HOA rules, and dramatic videos recounting every detail from her perspective. She continued to insist she had been denied respect, claiming moral and social authority that the law did not recognize. Yet the audience for these posts dwindled over time. Neighbors and community members learned to ignore the provocations, understanding that responding only fueled further chaos. The HOA itself underwent a transformation. Leadership was rotated, bylaws were rewritten, and accountability became a central theme in all meetings. Camera coverage at entrances and formal documentation of complaints became standard practice. The community had learned the hard way that a single person's obsession could disrupt order if left unchecked. By setting clear rules, enforcing boundaries, and maintaining transparency, the neighborhood reclaimed control, not just of property, but of peace and civility. Karen's next move was telling. Without physical access to the property or the ability to confront residents directly, she staged one final live stream from a nearby park, outlining her grievances in great detail. She recounted every confrontation, every arrest, every perceived slight, all while maintaining the posture and intensity she had always carried. But in the quiet suburban setting, her dramatic flair had less impact. There were no neighbors watching from fences, no officers standing nearby, just the muted hum of the city, indifferent to her spectacle. Eventually the house sold, the driveway emptied, and life continued. Karen remained a cautionary tale, her story retold during HOA meetings as a lesson in boundaries, accountability, and the dangers of conflating control with respect. Residents reflected on their own responses, recognizing moments when intervention, or clear documentation, could have prevented escalation. While she believed she had been wronged, the reality was clear. Authority without legitimacy collapses under scrutiny, and unchecked obsession carries consequences. The neighborhood, though bruised by the experience, emerged stronger. Peace returned not because Karen had been silenced, but because the community had learned to respond collectively, firmly and calmly. And as for Karen, wherever she was now, the final chapter of this story served as a permanent reminder that power cannot be claimed by volume or audacity alone. It must be earned, recognized, and respected by everyone it affects.